Hey, when was the last time you found yourself comparing your life with someone else's? Maybe they had something that you wanted, or maybe it was actually their life you kind of wanted. In this episode, we're going to talk about all the different ways in which this comparison game sabotages what God wants to do uniquely in our lives as we jump into part 7 of the journey. In 2014, Matthew McConaughey won an Oscar for Best Actor, and his acceptance speech was spectacular. So much so that people wanted to do interviews with him about his acceptance speech. And in just a few moments, I want to show you just a short 30-second clip from one of those interviews because they did a great job of piecing together some parts of his acceptance speech as well as some dialogue in between. But let me just frame for you what he's going to do in this clip, because when he actually gave the speech, he framed to the audience where he was going. Because he said every single day he needed 3 things. He needed someone to look up to, someone to look forward to, and someone to chase. Check out how he expounded upon this.
First off, I want to thank God, because that's who I look up to. To my family, that's who and what I look forward to. And to my hero, that's who I chase. I'm chasing me in 10 years. My hero's me in 10 years. That's a form of the first one of someone to look up to, but for me, it's the mortal version of who am I going to become. My hero's always 10 years away. I'm never going to be my hero. I'm not going to attain that. I know I'm not, and that's just fine with me because that keeps me with somebody to keep on chasing.
Looks up to God, he looks forward to his family, and he looks ahead. The person that he's chasing is himself 10 years down the road. I mean, it's so absolutely brilliant because Matthew understands that he can't be chasing someone else's story. He has to chase his own. And that just resonates for me so deeply in this journey series. And it just connects for us into a really significant story that I believe is going to be really helpful for us if we're going to journey well through life in relationship with God. And the story comes from John 21. Jesus has risen from the dead. He hasn't ascended back to heaven yet. And his disciples go back to the Galilee. And there are 2 stories that take place there. One takes place, I believe, at Mount Arbel. The other story takes place most likely at a place called Heptabagon, which means 7 springs. And it was an area where the fishermen loved to congregate in order to fish, clean their nets. I believe it's the same location where Jesus originally called Peter and the other disciples who were fishermen, and now they're going back to the same spot. And it's just a really cool story to look at another time. But for our purposes, Jesus is on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's early in the morning, and so this photo actually better captures that area. I took this picture a few years ago in that place of Heptabagon as the sun was rising. We know the disciples are out fishing. It's early in the morning. And this is the story where Peter jumps in and swims ashore, and he and Jesus have this amazing restoration conversation. And at the very end of it, Jesus mentions something to Peter about how he is going to die, and Peter has a very interesting response. Let's jump into the story together. John 21:19. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Okay, so just keep that phrase, follow me. Jesus is going to come back to that. And then it says, Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" So now we're talking about the disciple John. And then it says this, when Peter saw him, meaning John, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." So Jesus bookends this dialogue with, "Follow me, Peter." And it's what's happening in the middle that I find so fascinating, is that Peter's response to Jesus when he sees John, and by the way, there's always this competition going on between Peter and John. And you see this most evidently here in the Gospel of John. And Peter sees John, he says, "What about him?" And Jesus' response is, "What is that to you?" It's as if Jesus says to Peter, "Peter, forget about it. It doesn't concern you. Don't worry about what I am doing with John. Peter, you focus on what I am asking you to do." And what happens in this moment is something that I think is just true for many of us. Is it's so easy to fall into the comparison game. Like Jesus is speaking to Peter about his journey, and Peter wants to talk about John's journey. He wants to compare, "Jesus, what are you doing in John's life versus what you're doing in my life?" And Jesus' response is, "What is that to you?" And it just highlights this reality about being on the journey and what God is doing in each of our lives. And that reality is this, that we each have a sacred and holy path to walk. A path that is unique to us, that is unique to what God is doing in our life and in our story. But it's so easy to divert our eyes off of our path to someone else's path because we're interested in what's going on in their life. It's as if we are jumping into the comparison game. And so here's the premise for the episode, is this, is that nothing sabotages our path more than comparing ourselves to other people. Like, there's nothing that is going to obliterate your path and what God is doing in your journey if you're comparing yourself to other people. And this is something that I love, again, about what Matthew McConaughey was after. He's like, I can't worry about other people. Like, I got to chase where my story is going. And that's why it's so compelling, because for many of us, that isn't what we're doing. And I know that I struggle with this in my life as well. And so here's what I want to do, is I just want to offer up a few ways, observations, litmus test, if you will, that will help us to understand if we're sabotaging our own path by playing the comparison game. And I want to take you back 15 years ago. I first started teaching at that time. And I had several fantastic mentors in my life, and I just thought they were amazing, and they still are. But I remember going, okay, as I'm learning this whole communication thing, like, I want to do what they do. Probably more honestly, I wanted to be just like them. Like, I dressed like them, I listened to the music that they listened to, like, I had, different things that I acquired because that's what was important in their lives. And it was like, I just wanted to be like them. And little did I realize how much this was coming through when I was on stage teaching different communities. And it wasn't really brought to my attention. I didn't even realize it was going on until after one service. A guy came up and he said, "Hey, do you know so-and-so?" And I said, I do. And they said, "You sound just like them." In fact, they said, what's fascinating is that you sound more like them than they actually sound like themselves. Now, he meant that as a compliment. I received it as a critique. Because what I didn't realize is that I wanted to be like my mentor so much that I was acting just like them. It's a syndrome I would just simply call the copycat. And it's the idea that we become more like them and less like ourselves. When we are looking at our story in connection to someone else that we respect, admire, want to be like, it's so easy to become more like them and less like ourselves in the process. Now, here's what I'm not saying is that when we are trying to learn to do something, I'm not saying we shouldn't adopt the strategies that someone is employing or the ideas around how they're doing it. In fact, anytime you're doing something new, the way that you learn is through mimicking. But the problem is that we can mimic so long that we never mature. Because maturity comes when the mimicking is minimized and we come into our own voice. And that's what I wasn't moving towards. Like, I wasn't figuring out how God was uniquely crafting my voice. I was so interested in being like my mentors that my cadence was the same, my vocabulary was the same, like how I interacted on stage, my hand motions, like it was so them. And what I was confronted with in that moment that guy made those comments to me was, Brad, you need to mature into your own voice. Learn what others are doing. Learn from them. Apply it. But build out your voice in the process, because in comparing where your story is going, where their story already is that you can try to divert your story in such a way that you don't walk the sacred and holy path that God has for you. And so if we're starting to experience that copycat nature, we're probably sabotaging our path in a way because we're trying to make our path look so much like someone else's. That can be a positive thing, again, at times, but it can turn into something that is negative. And kind of that second litmus test for us to consider is just around discouragement. That if we're experiencing frustration, pessimism, feelings of inadequacy, then we're probably sabotaging our path in comparing ourselves to other people. Because it's really easy to look at someone else and go, I'll never be as good of a mom as she is. Or I'll never be as present of a father as he is. I'll never be as fit as she is. I'll never be as successful as he is. I'll never be as hip or as beautiful as she is. And it's like when we start drawing our eyes off of our own journey, our own path, and looking at other people, and we go, well, I don't think that I can acquire that, then we start to descend in to discouragement. We have these feelings of frustration. We have this pessimistic attitude. Oh, I can never be that. We feel this sense of inadequacy. You know, when you do see what other people are doing, it can be inspiring. It can be, well, like, I do need to be better in this area, or I can work harder here. And that's like a healthy, like, competition, if you will. But when we descend into discouragement and all of these feelings accompany it, we're probably comparing our lives in such a way that we are sabotaging the path that we are called to walk. And so it's almost like this progression. Like, we can try to acquire what we want, and if that doesn't happen, then we can start to get discouraged. But if we allow it to descend even deeper than that, we can experience something like envy. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I hear this word envy, and it's like, well, what does envy actually mean? How is it different than jealousy? How does this factor into the journey as a whole? Well, 7 years ago, my first book, Make Your Mark, was released into the world. When it was released, it did okay. It didn't do great. It wasn't abysmal. It was somewhere in between. But about the same time that my book was released, someone else released a book as well. And it hit the New York Times bestsellers list. Everybody was buying it. Everybody was talking about it. And I was like, what in the world is this book all about that, everybody is raving about? And I remember reading it. And as I finished it, I set it down. And the first words out of my mouth were, this book is crap. Like, this guy, all he did was distill what everybody's been saying for the last 10 years, watered it down and put it in one place, and everybody is drinking the Kool-Aid. And I remember just getting really angry about the success that this guy was experiencing. And what was really going on is that I was envious of what he was experiencing. Was his book crap? No, that was my envy coming through. See, initially I was jealous. I was jealous that he was experiencing the success that I was hoping to experience and wasn't. But what happens is that jealousy can move deeper, and when it moves deeper, it goes into envy, because envy is jealousy with resentment. That when we experience envy, we resent someone else's life because we feel we're getting gypped in our own. It wasn't that I was just jealous that he was experiencing success. It was that I held a grudge against somebody that I didn't know because they were experiencing a level of success that I wasn't. And because I couldn't acquire it, I couldn't get it, like I went into resentment. And it wasn't just resentment for them, it was actually resentment towards God. That God would allow them to experience that level of success, and that God wasn't allowing me to experience that level of success. I felt like I was getting gypped in my own story. And I remember the day where I just felt like God flooded me with a confrontational conversation where God goes, how joyful is this life for you right now? How grateful are you that you actually published a book that's making its way around? You're like, yeah, I know it wasn't what you expected or hoped for, but Brad, how is this working out for you? And it was just like that moment where you're like, man, I am sabotaging my own path. I am not living into gratitude. I'm actually living into entitlement. I can't celebrate someone else's success because it's a success that I wanted. I am living into jealousy and frustration, and I'm living into anger. And it was like, that is not how you navigate your path well. And it's so easy to do. It's so easy to look at someone and go, well, look at the job they got. Or look at the life they get to live, the car they get to drive, the house they get to live in, the marriage they get to be part of. Like, we can over-sensationalize someone else's life so easily. And we can look at our own path and completely miss the sacred and holy nature of what God has invited us on. And in order to walk it well, we have to crush this comparison game. Bronnie Ware, who is a nurse in Australia, works with patients who are in their last couple weeks of life. And she has all of these conversations, and she collated those conversations into a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, where she says, here are the top 5 things people regret most at the end of their life. And as you peruse through the list, they make sense. You would probably be able to highlight most of them. But it's not the number 5, the 4, the 3, the number 2, but the number 1 regret that is most surprising, that you probably wouldn't have put on your list. But when you hear it, you go, I see why it's number 1. And she distills it this way by saying, in the voice of the one who is regretting, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. It's so easy to not walk our own path for a host of reasons. And she said that's the number 1 regret, that people didn't live into the sacred and holy path that God had given to them. Peter's question, what about him? We could say, yeah, what about him? What about her? What about them? What is that to you? Jesus' invitation is, you must follow me. You have a sacred and holy path to walk. And you've got to crush the comparison game. Because when you crush the comparison game, you can walk your sacred path. And the only person you are chasing is you. And that's exactly who you're called to chase. Because Jesus will lead you along the path He has for you. And that is the best path to walk. So may we walk out that path well on our journey of life. Because that is where life and fulfillment is found.